Magic Treehouse Fact Tracker, Knights and Castles, a non-fiction companion to Magic Treehouse number 2, The Night at Dawn, by Will Osborne and Mary Pope Osborne. Chapter 1, The Middle Ages. Imagine that it takes 20 years to build your house. You need thousands of workers to build it. You need hundreds of servants to run it. You need a small army of armored men to protect it. Welcome to the time of knights and castles. We often read about make-believe castles in fairy tales and legends. The real castles that are most like the ones in fairy tales were built in Europe during the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages began about 450 AD. They lasted for over 1,000 years. This period of history is called the Middle Ages because it was between ancient times and modern times. It is sometimes also called the medieval era. Medieval is Latin for Middle Age. The Middle Ages were a time of great change in Europe. More people learned to read and write. The first universities were built. New kinds of painting and poetry were created. The Middle Ages were also a time of war and fighting. People fought with each other about religion. They fought about who should marry who. Mostly, they fought about land. Eyeglasses were invented in the Middle Ages. A university is a school of higher learning. Battle of Agincourt, 1415. During the Middle Ages, nearly all the land in Europe belonged to kings. Each king's land was called his kingdom. Most kingdoms were too big for a king to defend without help. So a king often turned over pieces of his kingdom to men he trusted. These men were called barons. The pieces of land were called fiefs or manors. Fiefs. A baron didn't own his manor, but he ruled over all the people who lived and worked there. And he could build a castle on the manor for himself and his family. In return, a baron swore allegiance to the king. That meant he was willing to die to protect the king and the kingdom. The baron also promised to send soldiers to fight for the kingdom if it were attacked. These soldiers were called knights. Knights swore allegiance to the king and the baron. In return, knights were often given their own manors to rule over. Most of the people who actually worked on the land were called serfs. Serfs. Serfs didn't rule over anyone. Some manors were very large. They could include several villages and many farms. Not all knights got their own manors. Some lived in a lord's castle. They all had no rights at all. Serfs were allowed to farm a tiny bit of land. They were allowed to keep some of what they grew to feed their families. They had to give the rest to the lord who ruled over them. In return, most serfs also worked in their lord's fields. Some worked in his household. Some even helped build the lord's castle. This system of trading the use of land for loyalty and work during the Middle Ages is called the feudal system. Feudal system. King, barons, knights, serfs. Anyone who ruled over land and the people on it was called a lord. Lords and ladies. In the Middle Ages, most rich people were nobles. Nobles came from families that had been wealthy for a long time. Noble women were called ladies. They could also have titles such as baroness, duchess, or countess. Noble men sometimes had titles such as baron, duke, or count. Lord Jack, Duke of Frog Creek. Lady Annie, Countess of Pennsylvania. The feudal system helped keep order during the Middle Ages, but it wasn't very fair. Not fair. A person almost always had to be born into the nobility. Even people who worked very hard and became rich could not normally become nobles. Today in Europe, America, and many other places around the world, people are free to try to be almost anything they want. Annie for president! Vote for Annie!